Happy New Year, degenerates, degeneritos, and degenerati. Welcome back to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 297, featuring Sean Strickland and Dricus Du Plessis. This is an extremely intriguing main event for yours truly, given the betting history that I have with each of these two, which, if you are a long-time listener at this point, going back to May of last year, you're well-versed with. Sean Strickland has been a former betting nemesis turned bright spot fueler of some of my greatest success last year. And Dricus Du Plessis is a fighter that I have backed since his fight with Brad Taveras in 2022. And since then, despite the skepticism and despite the odds against him in some fights and the juice in other spots, he has fought his way into a title contention spot. I think most people figured it was going to be against Izzy, perhaps at the first ever UFC Africa event, but it's not entirely out of the question if he wins. But to do it, he's going to have to overcome one of the most unlikely champions ever in the sport, if not for specifically who Strickland is himself, just the fact that his upset over Adesanya was one of the most inexplicable and unexpected, I think, in the UFC's history. Perhaps to the point that it was so shocking that it still doesn't even get the credit it deserves. But we'll be sure to get into that when the time comes to talk about the main event. There's 9 men's fights by my count on this card, and I've got picks for, I think, 6 of them. But the thing is, there's been some very funky line movement all week. And the way that it works with most of my grades is I have a certain amount of, leash I will give any given fighter out to, like ranges of 100 to 200, and then, minus 200 to minus 300, and then minus 300 to 400. Anything above 400 is, basically either not playable, or if it is somewhere slightly in that 400 range, I mean, you're basically getting the same value if you were to bet 500 or up relative to probability. So it's really not even worth it to consider it in most of the spots, but it's pretty rare that I, see things get out of hand relative to the advantages that I grade. I've still never had any fighter on the graphics that I put out. There's never been one fight where one guy has had every single advantage. There have been a couple close instances. The Aman Adalovsky, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but the Macedonian guy that got finished by I can't, like, that total screw. He went to a decision with Yatko, I think. But anyway, there's never been a totally lopsided one in any of these. But today, as I'm recording this Thursday morning, there's been some interesting, bizarre line movement. Such as I didn't feel comfortable playing Movsar of Evloev in the 200 range, but he has since now dropped down to 190, and if that price continues to fall, that is going to be someone that I'm going to be considering depending on, where it ends up going, because I'm more confident in him than I am, say, someone like Chris Curtis, who has similarly seen his price drop to a more valuable one today, but has still been kind of flirting around that same 2-to-1 range, just hasn't quite gotten out there. But in the event that Curtis were to, see late money come in on him that would put the line out to 200, at that point, I've already put out that I pick Curtis to win, whereas I put out I'm staying away from the Evloev fight. But now I'm in a position where I would actually consider playing one, and given how much the other fights have been moving and that plenty of other fighters on this card have floated out to being 2-1 favorites, it's difficult for me to consider. Malcolm Gordon obviously has been a controversial example this week, and we've seen Charles Jourdain go on kind of a late run here to go out to being 2-1, which I think is interesting. But I'll be sure to get into all of these and just kind of give some perspective. For some of these stayaways that I know I'm going to be staying away from, I'm probably going to glance over them pretty quickly. I don't want to talk a lot about UFC Vegas 84. I mean, obviously it's never a good feeling when your first bet of the year, especially when it's a 3-1 spot, goes belly up. And I remember putting the parlays together late last week and thinking that, I obviously made the decision to hedge between the Miller and the Ricky Simone fights. And that was because I didn't feel nearly as confident by any measure in Ricky Simone as I did with Jim Miller, even though Jim Miller was at a far more valuable price tag. But I decided to hedge with that, and I should have just leaned all the way into Miller and found a way to hedge off of the Tom Nolan spot, because I just barely had him graded into the 300 range, and I decided to settle for that because there weren't a lot of other valuable spots on the card. I mean, there were, Cortez Acosta was like a 600 favorite over Arlovsky at one point. Jean Silva was minus 900. There just wasn't a lot of leeway for me to do relative to what I had, picked to happen in the underdog spots I was on. But there was still a path to victory if I had, had more confidence in Basharat when his price tag on Friday after weigh-ins dipped below the 300 range into the 200 range, where I would have been more comfortable playing him. So if I had been a little more fluid in terms of allowing the price to come in and then playing that as on Friday as opposed to just sticking with Nolan, even though I had my own reservations and had seen how investing in inexperienced Dana White Contender Series members or veterans as parlay legs can come back to bite you. Hindsight's 2020, but it was still not the right move for me to make. And it's why I'm looking at what's happening this week and wondering, okay, should I, I'm more confident in Evloev. Should I take advantage of the price while it's here as opposed to, leaning in with Curtis, who is at a more playable number now, but I just know I'm not as confident in. I will get into those. The last thing I'll just say about Vegas 84 with, the Ricky Simone fight, I wish I had taped that one a little bit more. I think that Ricky Simone's ring rust probably played into it a lot, but the other thing that I found really interesting from that fight, and this is something that if I had taped it, I'll tape both of these guys a little bit more. And I mean, Batista's a person or a fighter I've backed in every spot he's been in since I started, going public with this. I remember staying away for the Kelleher fight, even though I had a strong grade on him, just because I was nervous about Kelleher's guillotine. But he quickly proved that he's hip to so many of these different tricks that, a lot of these other veteran fighters he's faced now try to throw at him. But the other thing I probably would have picked up is that, which was evident in this fight, and I had seen with Simone being a problem when I backed him for the Yadong fight, is that the guy really doesn't throw combos out further than 1-2s, and he's often just returning with single strikes and not throwing effective volume combos the way that we saw Batista consistently doing when he was putting the pressure on. And if I had taped it a little bit more and probably seen, a 4-punch combo from Batista. So, I did watch the Blackshear fight, but I wasn't watching it as much to see the improvements Batista has made from 2022 when I, last really aggressively watched like what he had to offer. If I had watched it more for like where the improvements he's made as opposed to trying to scrutinize for what kind of grappling success did Blackshear have that I think Simone can apply in this fight. I mean, we just didn't see. I mean, Batista showed in the Blackshear fight good ability to get back up, even though he lost the first round. But in the fight with Simone, I mean, Simone had the huge slam in round 3, and I felt reasonably good about seeing that and the effect that was going to have with the judges. But a guy like Simone, who had previously shown really good ability to retain dominant position, just like Batista, I think, butterfly guarded immediately and just started getting back up. Showed none of the guard goblin instincts we've seen from other practitioners like Johnny Munoz. He was very, very eager to get back to the feet and keep the fight going, and did that to what I was surprised to see was a 30-27 decision. I feel like Simone should have been credited for a knockdown in the first round, but I've been, on the wrong end of those before. I've spoken about the Armin Sarukian and Mateusz Gamrot fight from 2022 as an example of that. So there's just times where you think knockdowns have happened where judges or stat keepers disagree, and it just won't go your way, and that stinks because it can have a big effect. But it's not like Simone won the last 2 rounds, so even if they had credited him for that, I think he still probably would have ended up losing 29-28, and that was reflected in the judges' scorecards. So that's enough of the loss at UFC Vegas 84. I am trying to steer out of a bit of a losing streak here. We're a long way away from International Fight Week when I was declaring myself the hottest better in the world at that point. And I stayed on a pretty good streak out into, I think, September, October. If not a streak, then at least a nice handful of winning events. And obviously the year finished still very profitable with what a lot of the best people in this space are able to do. But, I mean, with a far better ROI than what, the market average is putting up. So we'll see if we can replicate that this year. I'm confident based on what my record is now that I can make it happen. Over 800 picks at this point, going to cross 1,000. Finally get a statistically significant sample at halfway through this year. So I'm excited about that. And with that, let's get into the first pay-per-view of 2024, and we will start with the early prelims featuring Malcolm Gordon and Jimmy Flick. These fighters enter on 2 fight losing streaks for each of them. Gordon's 14-7, Flick is 16-7. Flick did briefly retire a few years ago before coming back, but since coming back has not looked nearly as impressive as the fighter that once flying triangled Cody Durden, and I believe won his one of his impressive debuts prior to that. And I think you've really got to weigh that in pretty considerably here relative to what he's going up against. I mean, people have been critical of Gordon, but Gordon at least has faced a pretty good strength of schedule and hasn't been deterred in terms of what he's wanted to do and stick around. I didn't watch back his fight with Makayev, but I did, even though I knew that he kind of waned late in that fight to where Makayev was able to get the finish. I do remember being frustrated taking the under on that fight, especially after Makayev actually favorited the pick himself that I put out on Twitter. And then rather than actually, pull off the finish in the first round, Gordon was able to counter wrestle Makhachev in a way that I think really surprised a lot of people. But even though it surprised people, it was quickly forgotten just because Gordon eventually was finished and has not really had much to speak of since then. A lot of the weaknesses that these guys have are similar. The knock on Gordon is that he's been finished even more than Flick has, but you have to account for the fact that, like, in terms of Flick retiring and then coming back, he is just not reacted well to damage at all. And even though Gordon isn't necessarily a power puncher, he's still the fighter between the two of these guys that figures to have the striking advantage, even though he profiles as a guy that throws essentially the same amount of volume and is actually a slightly less accurate striker according to what the UFC stats have to say. Now, Flick, it's not that the striking is completely absent, but the striking defense just isn't there. And it's reflected in the significant strikes absorbed per minute. And that's really where Gordon is going to have the best opportunity to let his own skill set shine. He's going to have the advantage on the feet. It's really going to come down to, is he going to be able to stuff Flick's takedown attempts? But even though these guys shoot and land takedowns at not only the same rate, but the same efficiency, Flick is not doing it at a high enough level where you feel confident that he's going to be able to make an impression on, or use it as a method of dominating the fight, particularly as you saw Gordon, the counter wrestling he had against someone as good as Makhachev. It's going to be difficult for Flick to keep Gordon down on the ground to where he's going to be able to work out a submission or outright win rounds that way. And you can't feel good about his ability to deal with mounting damage as the fight goes on, particularly because even though these guys have the same amount of trips to decisions in their MMA careers, Gordon has been the one that has been able to win all of those. So I think that there's a pretty good established path for Gordon here to just not panic when Flick starts to shoot and to just kind of take what's going to be available to him, given he's going to have a 3-inch reach advantage. He'll have the better footwork. He'll just have he figures, even in this state where a lot of people like to, when people talk about the bottom of the barrel of the flyweight division, there's a lot of people that will just kind of, point to Malcolm Gordon and Jimmy Flick, which is why this is an interesting pairing. But I've heard Malcolm Gordon invoked consistently as, this has to be one of the worst fighters in the UFC. If he really was that, I don't think that we would see the line movement that we have seen this week. And while I do think that that's also a product of people coming to terms with what Flick finally is at this point, I think that too much has been put on Gordon in terms of downgrading his ability that probably explains why the line was in the original place that it was before more people took a step back and examined the pairing here and figured, well, one of these guys is on a bad stretch, but one of these guys is on a bad stretch that was preceded by a decision to outright get out of the sport. And a lot of people that have been capping this sport for a long time will tell you that once you mentally make the decision to just be absent, it really, really is difficult to recapture the form that you had before you made the decision to stop. And I think that Flick is unfortunately another one of those examples in this case. So I liked Gordon when he was, 160 at the top of this week. And now he's floated out to 220. And I don't like him at that price because it's not like Gordon is still a world beater in spite of everything I've just said. you could because of how many times he's been finished, you could see him making a mistake on the ground, maybe giving up his back to Flick, and then Flick still having enough of the grappling acumen to make him pay for that by being able to sink in hooks and go after a choke. The question is, how does he get the fight to a position where he's able to take the back or at least get some sort of advantageous clinch or some sort of a shot or takedown attempt on him, perhaps against the cage? How does he do that without getting himself hurt? It's easier to make a case for Gordon than it is for Flick, but making a 2-1 case for Gordon when I just don't really think there's much finishing upside there for him, I don't like that as much. So I am going to have to ride with Gordon. And again, this goes into what I said at the top of the show about the line movement kind of affecting, me put the days that I put my spots out on. I might only put Gordon now in the moonshot, but we'll see what's available, because again, I've got some no calls that I'm going to get to here in a minute, and this is a slim week for me on underdogs as well. I've only got one, so we'll see what's available. But in this first fight, I am going to go with the favorite, Malcolm Gordon. I thought after his last performance, I thought Flick might be done, at least, if not retire again, at least be done with the UFC. But I don't know if this is the last fight on his contract or what it is, but 3-fight losing streak for either one of these guys. I think it would be tough for the UFC to justify keeping them around. So I'm a little bit surprised to see Flick back. But we'll see if he can do something similar to what Mata did last week and prove my first juicy spot incorrect while salvaging his own UFC career. Best of luck. The next fight is Yohan, Lainesse, and Sam Patterson. Lainesse enters 9-2. Patterson is 10-2-1. Lainesse, the last time we saw him, I believe, got finished last year. Yeah, and on February 25th. That was Fight Night Muniz Allen. He lost to Mike Malott, his fellow Canadian, also fighting on this card by submission. Whereas the last time we saw Patterson was also early last year, about a month after Lainesse fought. We saw Patterson get knocked out by Yanal Ashmouz at UFC 286 in the first of 2 pay-per-views in London last year. Or I don't know about 2 pay-per-views, but 2 fight events at least. Because we saw Ashmouz, I believe, that was at when Aspinall fought Taveras. Anyway, so my point is ring rust isn't going to be a factor for either of these guys because their layoff is, or at least for one more than the other, because these guys have had equally long layoffs. So at that point, you have to start looking for what are the other discrepancies that are going to be here. And Lainesse is always someone that I had like a strong read on early on that I've had to become somewhat cautious with. In the infancy of my betting career, so about maybe a month after I had my run of fortune at UFC Columbus, exactly a month actually, was when Lainesse fought Gabe Green, and I was very, very confident on Lainesse that night as an underdog, and he was winning the fight, and I felt very good about that, about his ability to pull it out from there. But even after knocking down Gabe Green, just wasn't able to find the finish, let him get back to his feet, and eventually just kind of demonstrated his gas tank isn't the best for 5 rounds and got finished. When he fought Darian Weeks, I had a very strong grade on him as well. But in my opinion, I don't believe that he won that fight. And that was the one instance in the entire time I've done this where I decided to pick a money line that was the opposite of what the number I was getting back was telling me. And I ended up regretting it because Lainesse, even though I didn't think he won the fight, still got the split decision over Darian Weeks. And if I had just done what the analysis had told me, I would have had an underdog win. So I haven't, even in the cases where I've hedged off, I haven't had another instance where I've directly gone against what the numbers are telling me to do. He fought Mike Malott next, and I hedged the under in that fight because the money line on Malott was too outrageous relative to Lainesse, and that was proven successful. So I've finally turned it around a little bit in terms of reading the best ways to play Lainesse, I guess. But Sam Patterson comes in as someone that is still a little bit unproven in his own right from Contender Series. And given the uncertain nature of each of these guys, you kind of wonder how this fight plays out if it does go the distance. They have a similar amount of experience in that regard as well as success. So it's unclear which one of them presumably would have the edge in the final round. But we do know that Lainesse tends to fade when the fight gets extended. And that could be something to consider and be worried about here. But the way it is right now, it's Lainesse is around minus 140. He was minus 145 when I picked him earlier this week. And I think what ends up being the key here is that even though height and reach aren't really going to be a factor in this fight, even though Patterson owns 2 inches of reach and height respectively in both of those, because that still falls within the range of consistent or not impactful enough, both of these guys have good power, but we know Lainesse does. And if Lainesse is able to have an easier time finding and connecting on Patterson's chin early in the fight, and we just saw Patterson get knocked out in his last fight, and even though his damage tolerance should presumably be a little bit better as he's making his pro debut at welterweight, that's still going to be extra weight that he's carrying that makes you wonder about his own late performance ability relative to Lainesse's if it gets there. There's enough question marks and a discrepancy in which one of these guys has the larger capacity to get hurt early on in the fight and deal a knockout blow. I think Lainesse is very much the more optimal choice in that regard. And then you add on top of all that, if you do get to the point where this is going to the final round, and maybe it's 1-1 heading into the third in an obvious manner, in a case with two fighters that aren't the most seasoned in that stage of MMA, wouldn't you rather have the guy that has a bunch of friendly Canadians rooting for him than the other option? So I'm going with Lainesse here. I think he is a good play at 140. I wish that there were some other spots on this card that didn't have as much juice, just because I would feel much more confident in playing those than a guy that, even though he technically has double the UFC experience that his opponent has, Lainesse has still only appeared in 4 fights and owns a 2-2 record. Patterson's 1-1 coming off a KO, and we haven't seen either of these guys fight in almost a year. So not the best price in the world, but still I think pretty good relative to the upside that Lainesse has on paper. So give me Lainesse here I'm going to say he knocks out Patterson in the first round. The next fight is Serhiy Sidey and Ramon Taveras. Taveras? All week I thought it was Taveras and now I'm seeing it's Taveras. Ay Dios mío. Anyway, I don't have much to offer on this, so I'll try to keep this quick. If you watched the Contender Series fight, it didn't last very long. If you watched Taveras get his redemption shot a month later, it's not often that fighters get to appear a month after being knocked out in the first round, but in this case, everybody that saw the stoppage was in pretty universal agreement that it was fairly early, and that is reflected in the fact that they wanted to remake this. As soon as Taveras knocked out his follow-up opponent on what I believe was the finale of Contender Series last year, I mean, you could see Dana White talking to one of the other UFC brass people like, word, all right, let's get it rebooked. So this is a compelling fight to watch again, just because, there was a first-round finish in this pairing so recently in what was an otherwise volatile matchup that Taveras might have been winning. There's still the avenue for Sidey to just get an actual finish and a knockout and get the job done right this time, even with the encouraging signs seen from Taveras. So it's a difficult it's a difficult call to make. And again, speaking about the volatility of the Contender Series veterans, this is a case in which, especially with so many other fighters that are more established being available in the same range that you see Sidey at for this, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to invest in either side here, given how unpredictable this result is going to be. That said, if Sidey knocks out Taveras again a second time, everybody that laid the juice will say it was obvious based on the previous result. If Taveras beats Sidey, then everybody that took Taveras as an underdog will say that the first fight was a fluke, and the rebooking and everything that happened after the first fight was a justification of that mindset. So there's just too many bad signals and unknowns all around here, and it's unfortunate because in one of only 9 men's fights this week that we're getting, especially when you have 2 fights featuring Canadian fighters on the early prelims, you then get to this fight. And I know Sidey is technically hailing from Canada, even though he's fighting under Ukraine's flag, but to not have more established guys on the prelims, this fight should be maybe the headlining early prelim, and one of the fights on the early prelim should be bumped up to this spot, because there's not enough known here to make a good call, and I wonder how much intrigue is really going to be here for this rematch because of that. But that being said, if you watch the first fight live, I think it's worth tuning in for this one to see what happens, because it's not often that we get to see, especially on such a short timeline, fighters run it back like this, particularly when there was a finish rather than a decision. So it'll be a curious novelty to witness just for that, but I would limit it to just spectating. I wouldn't invest in either side here. Let one of these guys or both of them prove themselves. Maybe they'll put on a spectacle, or maybe lightning will strike twice. But either way, don't put any money on it. The next fight is Charles Jourdain and Sean Woodson. But really quick before I get into that, I'm going to keep it a buck. I don't know how many full-time fans, so to speak, we have. Long-time listeners, ones that listen front to back. I know the way I cut it up, it's usually easier for people to just get the fight they want and move on. But I know that there's some people that actually look forward to the entire show. And, for a small content creator, I'm sure most of the people that are used to showing their affection or replying maybe affection's the wrong word, but showing their appreciation and replying on social media. I would imagine there's more than a few cases where you don't really get any sort of reciprocal response from the creators that you're engaging with. I just want to say to everybody that not only this week, but has ever told me that they're excited to listen to the RAXPOD or that they're looking forward to it, that I don't think that you understand how much fuel that gives to small-time creators. When you're putting your opinion or product or whatever out in the world, and you're confident in what you have to offer, but you're not sure how people at large are going to respond or when the response is going to come in. I mean, any little sign of gratitude or excitement that you get from people that are engaged with it, I mean, it can light a fire. I mean, it really can. When you know that there's at least one person out there that is really vibing and responding with what you are putting out into the world, it can sometimes just be all you need to get through and keep pressing on even when things kind of aren't looking so great. So, I acknowledge that I'm in a bit of a streak, didn't have a winning event in December and started the year off not great. So morale isn't super high right now. As I said at the top of the show, we're a long way from International Fight Week last year. But, if you're a fan and you've shown love or you continue to, I just want to let you know I'm very grateful for that. So thank you. Anyway, Jourdain Woodson. So when I initially graded this, I looked at the stats, I mean, there were a lot of things that were jumping out to me. And I'll go over each of them with you now, even though I'm sure most people by this point are probably aware of it themselves. But the first thing that obviously jumps out when you just compare these guys on tail of the tape straight up is that Woodson's 9-inch reach advantage is not something I think that Jourdain has really had much experience dealing with. I'm sure that as a featherweight with a reach that is less than 70 inches, Jourdain is probably used to having a reach disadvantage if one exists in his matchups. That being said, anytime you're getting out to half a foot to 7 inches is usually where the statistically significant or significance of the reach discrepancy comes into play relative to long-term winners. In this case, you're getting out to 9 inches. That's a very extreme example. I believe there was an example either last year or from the year prior it might have been one of Vanessa Demop. I'm totally fumbling her name, but Vanessa Demopoli, I believe she was fighting Maria Oliveira. Maria Oliveira had something like a 10 or 11 inch reach advantage, and she still ended up losing the fight. But there was so much speculative action on Oliveira just because she had that reach advantage and not really anything else, that there was a pretty decent amount of action that went in on her, despite the fact that the old principle in betting women's MMA is just bet the woman with the grappling advantage. And sure enough, Demopoulos ended up pulling that one out. So, reach isn't the universal end-all be-all when you get out to these extreme lengths of 9, 10, 11, but it is significant in the sense that Woodson is primarily a boxer, and the fact that a boxer is going to be equipped with a 9-inch reach advantage kind of makes you wonder what is really going on here in terms of why is Woodson such a substantial underdog. What does Jourdain have going for him other than being a Canadian fighting in Canada, coming off of a much better 2023 for his stock than how 2022 ended? But what has he necessarily done to earn the right to be a 2-1 favorite in this spot against someone who in some ways has some similar career outcomes? And I'll get into those later on. But the other thing that really concerns me about Jourdain being a 2-1 favorite here is that when you look at his UFC stats, I mean, there's a lot that gets made about him being this supposed submission ace, or at least a good enough grappler that he was able to kind of beat Kron Gracie at his own game, even though we knew Gracie was over the hill relative to MMA and had been out for about 2 to 3 years when they fought. But Jourdain is not a guy that initiates or even lands a lot of his takedown attempts. And even the ones that he does land are remarkably inefficient. And his takedown defense, conversely, for like preventing fights from getting to the ground isn't even that great. And when you look at Woodson's stats that were largely inflated by his fight with Bazookia, because prior to that he had almost never even made an attempt to shoot, let alone threaten a takedown, Woodson is actually now doubling up Jourdain in takedowns per minute and takedown accurate, more than doubling up. I mean, Woodson's averaging 7 times more takedowns per 15 minutes, and his takedown accuracy is 5 times the amount of what Jourdain's is. Now, does that mean we should expect Woodson to shoot? I don't think so. I do think Woodson has a better jiu-jitsu game than perhaps what he's being given credit for. One of the significant reasons he was able to, despite getting knocked down twice in the opening round of that fight with Luis Saldana, one of the reasons he was able to come back in that fight was because the last 2 minutes of the second round was spent in a buggy choke that Woodson was able to pull off from his back after he'd gotten taken down. And then both guys were gassed enough in the third round that Woodson made enough of an impression with his boxing that he was able to get the third round from at least one judge, and it ended up going to a split draw. He was a minus 300 favorite that night, and they were fighting in Salt Lake City. So you have to take into account that the altitude probably had a significant effect on the cardio of both of them, given they were tired at the end. But then you also wonder how that may have affected Woodson's damage tolerance, given he has still never been technically knocked out in a UFC fight, but his chin in that fight caused enough, or I guess signaled enough alarms, that I think that what happened in that fight is kind of baked into why his price tag is what it is here. Because Jourdain, although we've really only seen it against Duho Choi, the guy can crack when he's given the opportunity, and he is very much a guy that can turn up to volume striking when the situation calls for it. His fight with Shane Burgos, in which I picked him to win as an underdog, very much represented that. He would have had a pretty clear case for winning that fight had Burgos not backpacked him the entire second round, and I believe grappled him for part of the third as well, and outright won the first round. So it was a difficult spot for Jourdain, I think, but he did come back pretty well the last year, even though I don't think he necessarily fought the highest level competition between Gracie and Ricardo Ramos, who I think was also a little bit overrated in his own skill set as well. In both of those cases, those were fighters that I'm less certain in terms of making this for Ramos, obviously, but those are both guys that I think are primarily submission credentialed fighters. I don't think Ramos was necessarily known for his striking or knockouts or anything like that, even though he had gotten a first-minute finish in his most recent appearance prior to fighting Jourdain. So that's not to say I'm more impressed with Woodson's strength of schedule. I have concerns about him too, but there's just enough variables with Woodson here that I don't understand why the fight is lined the way that it is. I still favor Jourdain to win. At the end of the day, the guy is a much more potent finisher and has proven it at the UFC level than what we've seen from Woodson. Woodson has effectively proven at this point to be a guy that is very, very good at fighting his specific style, but when he's not able to keep the fight specifically within those or whatever you want to call it, within those boundaries, Woodson has shown to give away points and struggle a bit. And guys that do have power are going to be able to hurt him a little bit. I think going forward, he's still 31, so it's not like the guy's even out of his prime yet. But the long career as a boxer, combined with the fact that we did see him get dropped twice in the first round by a guy in Saldana who's not really known for his power. Again, it took place in Salt Lake City. You take into account the altitude, but you understand why people have reservations, even though you're able to put them into context. The other thing that makes this a bizarre conundrum for me is that Jourdain has not proven to be a good performer when the fight goes the distance. Again, I've explained before how the final round percentage that I use for assessing this for fighters isn't always necessarily accurate to a T, just because I'm not actually going in and seeing, okay, did they win the third round, as much as just seeing, did they close out the fight in a unanimous decision fashion, or did they end up going to a split? In most of the cases with a split, they end up, it comes down to the third round, and it's usually a varied opinion about what happened. But the same thing can be said for a lot of different fights where it was less obvious. But the point is, when you see a lot of unanimous decisions on a fighter's record compared to splits or losses by decision, regardless of what their consensus was, you're going to normally see better performance from the guy that's proven they can, go the distance and consistently stay in the good graces of judges than the fighters that are not. It's a big theme I've made on this card. I pointed out for a lot of fighters that there's a big discrepancy in experience going the distance for a lot of my picks this week. And that's not the case with this Jourdain-Woodson matchup. Both fighters have gone the distance 7 times each in their UFC careers. Interestingly enough, they've also been only finished once in MMA, and in both cases it was from Julian Erosa, and the same submission, not a guillotine or a rear naked choke, but a darce in the case of both of them. So highly, highly interesting there, and that's going to get into why I'm making the pick on this fight that I am. But the final point I wanted to get to just about late round experience is that Jourdain gets doubled up again, as he did in takedowns per 15 minutes and takedown accuracy, by Woodson in this case. Jourdain's only won 43% of the final rounds he's gone to. I think the best example of him struggling in the final round of a fight that may have been ambiguous but ultimately proved not to be was the fight with Nathaniel Wood at the end of 2022. Obviously, he won the final round against Gracie, but the Gracie fight was hardly going to tell you anything long-term about this guy's ability to compete with, more seasoned strikers like the Sean Woodsons of the division. So Jourdain's got a little bit better momentum, but again, if this does go to decision, the guy that's proven to be nearly twice as more effective in that third round as Jourdain is Woodson. But the flip side of that is the fight is in Canada. The fans are not going to be cheering any of Woodson's work. If Jourdain can just land, maybe a couple or 3 power shots, he's going to get enough of a reaction from the crowd that if there's tangible damage to Woodson's face and he's not really able to hurt Jourdain in any way further than just point fighting, it's very possible the judges are influenced into giving one or multiple rounds to Jourdain based on the reception that he gets from the Canadian fans. And they're rabid, man. I bet against a couple of them at 289 when all the Canadians swept on the card. And I mean, it really, it was taking the wind out of my sails watching some of those fights and just hearing the pop that the fighters would get relative to their opponents that were, fighting out of America or wherever else, and just not getting anything. The biggest example I can think of is Blake Builder, Kyle Nelson, which Kyle Nelson, you'd never heard an audience go wild for Kyle Nelson like they did that night. It was it was tough to watch, if I'm being honest, but it taught me something important about the loyalty and resolve of the Canadian fans to their fighters. So I very much have to take that into account here when I'm making this pick. And so even though when I looked at the numbers, I was getting the initial read that Woodson was the way to go, I did end up grading Jourdain to win after, running the tape a little bit on Woodson's last couple of fights. But I don't have a strong enough grade on Jourdain to want to play him in the 200 range. The much better play here is the plus 2.5 rounds. You're looking at a situation where each of these guys have gone over 12 and a half minutes in 14 of their 19 total UFC events. And as I alluded to earlier, the only time that they've ever been finished in either of their MMA careers, it was at the hands of Julian Erosa, who is his own freak for featherweight. So outside of being finished by an anomalous, somewhat glass cannon in the featherweight division, neither of these guys have ever lost in a finishing capacity in their MMA careers. So is a guy like Woodson, who isn't really known to throw with power despite his boxing acumen and experience, going to be the first person to punch out Jourdain? Is he going to, his newfound submission ability, supposedly, even though neither of these guys try more than half of a submission per 15 minutes, do you expect him to get what I believe would be his first submission victory? It would be his second submission victory in MMA, sorry. The first fight of his career was a guillotine, although that was in 2016, and we haven't seen Woodson win by submission since. Conversely, Woodson's only lost by submission once. That was the Erosa fight with the Darce choke. So if you're not super confident that Jourdain is going to be able to put in his slap on his sixth submission win and what would be his second in the UFC, I think you're probably hoping that Jourdain knocks him out. But the flip side of that is that Woodson has really never been knocked out, and we've only really seen him knocked down, put in a compromising position in the fights where, he, excuse me. We've only seen Woodson knocked down on the fights where he's fighting at altitude, which I don't think is going to be the case in Toronto. So I think the 2.5 rounds is the much more valuable play here, just relative to where Jourdain's line is. And I think that helps with, if it turns out that the striking proves to be too much for Woodson, then we very much, I think, are going to get if the striking proves to be too much for Jourdain from Woodson, you're going to find a situation where I think Woodson very much just wants to kind of coast to the end as he gets comfortable, possibly takes the first round off to, download the data, so to speak. Conversely, with Jourdain, I wonder how much he's going to be hunting a submission if he's able to put the fight on the ground, regardless of if it's a knockdown or he's able to break the takedown defense of Woodson. But I do think Woodson's own jiu-jitsu ability is being a bit discredited in the sense that I think he can survive longer on the ground with Jourdain than people are maybe giving him credit for. And not only that, we've seen a bit of some guard goblin-y behavior from Woodson. He really did do that in the second round when he got taken down against Saldana. And then rather than kind of work to get back up quickly, he set himself up for the buggy choke. So if Woodson remains a little bit too comfortable to fight off of his back, particularly against someone as sharp as Jourdain down there, I think that you're going to end up getting into more of a grappling stalemate than you are a position where either one of these guys ends up finding a finish on the other on the ground. And in the event that there's ability to get up, even if Woodson doesn't immediately pursue that, I would think that he recognizes how much more to his benefit it is to fight on the feet than to fight on the floor, and will hopefully try to get it back into his best wheelhouse for winning. So short of Jourdain knocking out Woodson, I think that this is a very, very solid play for this card. It was minus 155 when I called it. I'm not sure what it's at now. I can look for you very, very quickly. I guess I owe you that much. It's still minus 150, which is, I call it minus 150, not minus 155. So I hate making overs legs just because, a lot of shit can go wrong in there, like an injury or whatever. And then you hate when your night gets ended on a injury loss. I had more than a couple of those the first year I was doing this. So I can't remember the last time I put out one of my main parlays that had an over with a leg on it, but this has been such a funky market, and this is one of the only spots all week that has stayed consistent in what I've seen, just in terms of the line movement relative to my own confidence. So I do feel very good about this. Again, I'm picking Jourdain to win. I don't trust him at 2-1. I think that there is a chance that Woodson is able to just provide too much of a puzzle on the feet, but I think that the much safer play here is that this ends up going to decision, and in that case, you would rather just take the money out of the hands of the judges and just leave it in what you think is going to be the result based on what these two have demonstrated. So give me the +2.5. The next fight is Brad Katona and Garrett Armfield. So one of the only fights that I missed at UFC 292 was, or actually to be more specific, I crushed UFC 292, made I think about 49 units with the help of not only a 4-leg main parlay that hit, but then also tacking O'Malley at, I believe, 200 or plus 215 onto the end of that for a little bit more. So that was an excellent night. But the two of the key fights that I missed that ended up, I don't want to say getting me in a hot water, but then ended up putting me in a beef with a certain less than desirable ex-police officer were the tough finals. And I did end up missing both of them, and I called an underdog on one of them. But the fight that was less contentious between the two in terms of my opinion on why one was going to win was taking Cody. Is it Cody Simon over Brad Katona? It's not Cody Simon. Sorry, Cody Simon is related to my other gig. Cody Gibson. Cody Gibson was who fought at 292 for the tough title. And, you know, if you recall, I said I wasn't going to be able to watch a lot of the card because I was going to be at a bachelor party. And even though, you know, as the events became apparent that the night was kind of winding down and I was potentially looking at a big night, and I ended up meeting other people at the bachelor party that were fight fans. I did end up getting to watch a lot of the main card, although we skipped the Wang Li fight, which I think was the right decision. But I ended up missing both of the tough finals, so I didn't get to see Kevin. Oh gosh, I'm gonna totally fumble his name, but it was like Holobo or something. Let me get this right for you. His name, forgive me, it was Austin Hubbard and Kurt Holobaugh. So I was close, but I picked Hubbard to win as a favorite. I thought about making him a leg, and thank goodness I did not. Oh my gosh, that would have been really devastating way for that night to end. But the fight before that, I had missed it. I heard it was an excellent fight. I was curious to see how close Cody had actually gotten to winning because there were two 29-28s and one 30-27. But I didn't actually watch the full 15 minutes until I sat down to tape Katona for this card. And my God, if that wasn't one of the most unsung fights of 2023, I know that when it happened, people gave a very positive response, but I was shocked that in all of the year-end contending, showcases and awards for fights last year, Katona Gibson was not mentioned as one of the best, despite the fact that these guys were just throwing combos at each other for 15 minutes. Not just single strikes, not just trying to figure each other out, not just point fighting, but I mean just like hitting and returning emphatically. And it was just, I was so impressed with Katona being obviously having the height and the reach disadvantages, with how sharp his striking was and how resolved he was to respond going forward, and with multiple hits, tripling up the jab at certain points. It was a fight that Rogan even said, and it was, obviously it's a bit cliche to do this with a tough final, but you could understand why Rogan was saying it reminded him of the Tough One final featuring Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner. It was really a really awesome fight to witness, and it made me a believer in Katona. I know that he's an older veteran here, so it's it's tough to, call this guy a rookie, especially given he did have the stint in the UFC prior to this. And Katona's a guy who had gotten a little bit sandbagged for his approach going into that fight too. The narrative on him had been he's always going to be a guy that's trying to initiate the clinch and the tie-ups because he knows he's the shorter guy. He's going to try to put you in the ground and wrestle and hold you down. He's just a very well-blended MMA game that in kind of his discredit, he gets painted as this well-rounded guy, and then his striking kind of gets lost in the wash. Whereas you watch his fight with Gibson, and it's just so impressive how he was able to return on everything. And not only that, lost the first round on 2 judges' scorecards, was wearing pretty bad damage, had swelling on the side of his face next to his eye, and was still able to win the last 10 minutes in what was arguably the most important fight of his career. Very, very impressive performance from Katona last time out, even though Gibson isn't, necessarily a wily UFC veteran. Now, Garrett Armfield has had his own impressive performances. I know a lot of people have made light of the fact, or not light of the fact, but they've shed light on the fact that he took the fight against Onama a weight class up on very short notice, still arguably won the first round, and still just kind of ended up letting it get away from him after Onama finally started imposing the strength advantage on him. I wonder, given Armfeld's kind of fearlessness in that, how much he's actually going to be able to get held on the fence or held down on the mat by Katona if it gets to there. But I saw enough encouraging work from Katona against Gibson that even if the fight does end up staying standing, I'll still feel pretty good about Katona, despite even if he drops the first round, that he can win the last 2. And the other reason for that is because he's vastly more experienced and successful going the distance than Armfield is. Armfield has 2 trips to a decision in his MMA career, which includes 12 fights total. So 1/6 of all of his fights have gone to decision. That doesn't sound terribly inexperienced, but the problem is he has no unanimous decision wins in either of those trips. And they were in LFA and Shamrock FC. In LFA, in his 3rd fight ever, he lost a unanimous decision to Ronnie Lawrence, who you'll recall was white kung fu lotus master or something like that, and was getting pretty gassed up by the UFC during the early stages of the Apex era before returning against Dan Argueta last year in a fight I had him heavily favored to win, and just really did not look effective at all, and kind of ended up getting bailed out by, I believe it was Chris Taglioni, making it was either, no, it might not have been Taglioni. I think it was actually Keith Peterson that, said that Lawrence tapped when no tap had actually taken place. So pretty bad. It was a lot like the Trey Ogden-Mata fight, although it was a much worse example than that. So you look at the best fighters he's faced getting into the UFC, Armfield, and prior to fighting Onama and Kazama, I mean, Ronnie Lawrence seems like it's probably the best name out of the guys that he's faced, and did not go well going to decision. Now, he still has knockout power. I mean, we've seen it. The guy can crack, and he is a feisty enough guy that he's able to hang with someone like Onama up a weight class on short notice. But the thing I wonder here, if you're Katona, who's proven to be a very savvy vet, is you recognize that this guy has not had a lot of success in fights that go late, whereas you're a fighter that has been to decisions, I believe, in every UFC fight he has had, even going back to his first stint, and that is correct. He's gone to decisions in 6 of all 6 UFC fights, if you're including the first tough finale he fought at, as well as the most recent one and the semifinal he had against Timur Valiev, who could arguably be a better opponent than anyone that Armfield has faced, or at least defeated. So there's, and then not only that, one other thing that I'll point out is that, it's not just the amount of times Katona's gone the distance. He's gone 6 times as often as Armfield has across both of their UFC careers. Katona's got 12 trips to Armfield's only 2. But it goes further than that, and the Katona's had 3 times the success in the final round that we've seen from Armfield. We've only seen Armfield get 1 split decision, whereas Katona has a 75% success rate in that final round and has unanimous decision wins in half of his UFC appearances. He had a split decision against Timur Valiev, and then his 2 losses were to Merab Dvalishvili and Hunter Azur, and those were only 4 years ago. So he has good experience even in his losses from fighting these guys, and he's shown he's comfortable with his game plan enough to consistently implement it. It's not just that he's gone to a decision in all of his UFC trips. I think it's something like in the last 10 fights he's only had 1 fight end by a finish, and every single one of those fights has gone into the 3rd round. Brad Katona has not had a fight end prior to the 3rd round since his 2nd career appearance in 2015. Since then, he's been a religious pilgrim to the 3rd round. It happens in every single fight he's had since 2016. So if Garrett Armfield follows that trend that Katona has set for his own career, how do you feel good about him performing late when everything tells you that he hasn't been able to do it well so far in his MMA career? I think Katona's one of the only, perhaps the only 2-1 favorite this week that is justified in that range. It's very, very clear to chart where the path for what he wants to do will go, and it's easy to see how Armfield will struggle in that regard just because of what we've seen from him historically. So it is possible that the guy makes improvements, but I think that one thing that a lot of people will tell you is that cardio is pretty consistently the hardest thing. I don't know about the hardest thing, but it's one of the harder things to improve overnight or within a slim timeline. Armfield's got an age gap here that he can, presumably take advantage of to make improvements to his game during this time off that he's had. But between the strength of schedule and the inability to perform in late rounds, I just don't see how you could go with anyone other than Katona here. So I am going to be picking Katona. That's not even taking into account the fact that he's going to have all of Canada rooting for him as the most recent tough winner, and that's going to have a significant effect, as I alluded to earlier. If the fight goes to decision and it is close, the judges are going to be heavily influenced, I think, by the guy that's been getting the better reactions from the crowd, and that's almost certainly going to be Katona. So give me Brad Katona to win by, I'll say, unanimous decision, but I wouldn't be surprised if it goes to split if Armfield's able to, put in some good work, not just in the first, but also in the 2nd round. The next fight is Movsar Evloev and Arnold Allen. Some people were a little bit surprised as I was chopping it up in the weigh-in chat for this fight. I know I said I started recording this on Thursday, but it's now Friday, so I did watch the weigh-ins already today. But some people were surprised that, I wasn't outwardly preaching the over for Evloev given how automatic it's been, despite the juice that's attached to it. I remember when Evloev fought Ige, the plus 2.5 was minus 400, and I had never seen anything like that. The fight did end up going to decision, go figure, but it made me a bit sad because I thought, wow, this guy, if he ends up getting, these high-level fights in the future, they're always going to be insanely juiced out to go to decision just because of who he is and what he's done, and there's not really going to be any value on it. And then he got the Diego Lopez matchup, and there were plus odds on the over. And I couldn't resist. Had to take it. So that's why it's easy for me to look at that fight he just had where, he narrowly escaped getting submitted multiple times, but was still a step ahead on just about everything Lopez was trying until the, I believe it was a leg lock at the end. of their fight. But Evloev, I mean, was a step ahead on everything, and I was confident that he was going to win. I just didn't like what his money line was at, and given the plus odds on the over, I said if I'm favoring him to win and he's going to drag it out to decision as he always does, why would I not take that? It's not the same case here because Allen has, I think, he's a more proven commodity than Lopez was, not only in the sense of what he brings to the UFC, but also just in terms of consistent trips to decision, which we've seen in most of his own fights in the UFC, although less often of late prior to the Holloway fight. But again, the Qatar fight was an injury, so you take that into account. And then Dan Hooker was fighting a weight class lower at featherweight than where he really should have been at when he got knocked out by Allen. So I don't necessarily think Allen has the one-punch lights-out power here that would neutralize Evloev from, maybe eating one, getting hurt, and then instinctively shooting a takedown to recover. But there was enough that I saw from Allen, in his fight with Holloway, that in terms of making strides later into the fight, that made me think if he does come out a little bit more aggressive, as he recognized he wasn't necessarily as aggressive early on as he should have been against Holloway, if he's more aggressive out of the gate, he's going to have a striking advantage that he will need to make the most of in the early half of the fight. I think that if he wants to end up winning and make a better impressions than Evloev presumably would with wrestling and mat returns and any other associated grappling that leads to ground damage. So it's when Evloev was 2-1, I didn't think that there was enough paths to victory for him to justify playing that price. But the last couple of days, he's come down into a more playable range, and he's now sitting at minus 183. And I think that I do have to play that. So I said too much juice on the favorite and the over by now, but that was on Wednesday, and his price has come down to 180, 183. Evloev is just so proven in terms of knowing what you're going to get and what he's going to try to do to win and just being high level effective at implementing it. I know that Allen has really surprised in a lot of his appearances. I remember being particularly impressed with the way that he won the Sadiq Youssef fight when I was taping that for Youssef's fight against Barboza. But there's also been enough vulnerabilities, I think, in Allen's losses that a guy like Evloev, who does not get enough credit for how smart he fights and just how smart he is in general. I think the guy was a software engineer or designer before he pivoted into MMA. The guy is, he fights, I don't want to say like a nerd, but he doesn't make a lot of mistakes further out than kind of stalling on the feet with striking just because it's not his most comfortable wheelhouse. That Allen, I can see this being his third loss, whereas with Evloev, I mean, I'm not saying that he's had the strength of schedule that Allen has, but we just haven't seen him put in as compromising of positions, even in his fights with, Nick Lentz that went to split decision, whereas I believe Allen beat Lentz unanimously. You've still seen more cracks from Allen than you have from Evloev, where I don't know if this is the right spot to fade Evloev yet. I don't know if Allen's takedown defense is pretty great at 76%, but he is a guy that's proven to be taken down before. And Evloev, 4.71 takedowns per 15 minutes is a lot. I mean, that's over, I think, a takedown and a half landed per round in an average fight. And this is a guy that has gone to decision in 7 straight fights. And the fight prior to that went to the 5th round, and he won on a punch. So I I just feel more confident in Evloev here. I'm going to be very, very worried if Allen shows good ability to fight back to his feet with, butterfly guard, and maybe I can't really see a position where he would, or a situation where he would like roll to his back and try to use a Kimura or something to like get up, because giving your back to Evloev after he's already put you on the mat, probably not the most ideal game plan. But I still just worry about, like even thinking about a fight like last week where you had Ricky Simón body slam Mario Batista, and even after that, still Batista, you saw with the butterfly guard and just the relentlessness to not accept the position, was able to get back to the feet and outright win the final round after Ricky started it out with a moment that would have made a pretty good impression on the judges if he had been able to keep the fight on the floor. He wasn't able to do that. I wonder if something similar could take place here, maybe in the later stages of the fight, where Allen shows the want to not accept the position from Evloev, and if that finally is able to deter Evloev's game plan enough where he's kind of got to be a bit more inventive than just shooting and going. I don't want to say the guy does a lay and pray, because he does do a good job landing ground strikes, much more so I think than a lot of other fighters that go with the wrestling heavy approach that he has. But I still just I think that there was enough reservation there for what Allen offers on the feet that playing Evloev at 2-1 was just not going to be the move. But now that he's dipped back below that number and sitting at like minus 183, I'm more willing to take a shot on that guy and that number than I am a lot of other favorites in this card that are floating around similar price tags. So give me Movsar Evloev. Probably going to end up making him a leg at this point, but we've still got some time before the event. We'll see what happens. The next fight is Chris Curtis and Marc-Andre Barriault. I don't speak French, so I know I just totally fumbled that, but, he's a Florida guy. He'll be all right. Anyway, Chris Curtis comes in 30-10, which is absolutely wild. He's had almost 2 times as many MMA appearances as his opponent, even though he's only 3 years older. Curtis is coming off a bit of a weird 2023 for him. It must have been weird for him to have the highlight of his MMA career last year being launching a podcast with his friend Sean Strickland, who would then go on to become the champion in his same division. So I wonder how he, kind of really feel. I'm sure he's super stoked for his friend and everything, but I'm sure it must have been a little bit frustrating to see someone in his division that he's so close with have that kind of success, whereas the Gastelum fight didn't really go his way for what he perceived to be an unpenalized head clash. And then the no contest against Imavov happens in a fight that he's, taken the first round off again in, may kind of seem to be working his way back into it, but then suffers another clash of heads, and it's got to be declared a no contest. So having an entire year of your career, particularly as you're over 35, getting kind of blown up by those head clashes is really unfortunate. And I do hope that Curtis will be able to turn it around here. If you watched his fight with Gastelum at 287, I did tape it recently before Gastelum fought at I'm forgetting who he fought, and he lost, and I picked the guy that beat. Was it? Oh gosh, I'm totally forgetting now. But you know what? I'm gonna have to look it up. Forgive me. Who did Gastelum just fight? Oh, it was Sean Brady. Right. I took the over on that. I didn't fade him, but I graded Brady to win, and he was better value, and I should have taken that. But it is what it is. Anyway, I was at 287, and in the middle of the second round, I very emphatically screamed out, "Let's go, Curtis!" And I was kind of embarrassed at how loud that I did it. And I was glad that when I watched the fight back, that either the audio didn't pick it up or the UFC edited it out because it was just too egregiously weird. So I was grateful my moment of embarrassment didn't make it to the broadcast, even if it happened in the stadium, especially because you can hear me yelling after Oliveira beats Gaethje at UFC 274. You can literally hear me going, wow, in the background like 3 times while DC is saying, this dude is a savage, right after Oliveira won. So that will always be my greatest contribution to the UFC commentary team. At least I think so. But regardless, Curtis, the thing that really concerns me about this fight, aside from the fact that he's in international territory again, as he was for the Hermansson fight that he lost, and we saw him get frustrated, and it felt like the crowd was kind of more on the side of Hermansson in that fight than they were on the American Curtis. And you got another situation here where there's going to be an international crowd very firmly backing a guy in Marc-Andre Barriault who in some ways has a bit more, I think, to offer in Curtis's preferred wheelhouse than what maybe some people would be expecting. I've seen some people that say they think Barriault can just fight the exact same way that Hermansson did and he'll get a decision and he'll easily win a decision. I don't know if he's as comfortable fighting that kind of style. It would be interesting to see. I think Hermansson might be a little small. No, I think they're both actually 6'1", but I do think that Hermansson, if you were to have him fight Barriault, you would see how Hermansson is a bit more, I think, put together pretty much in every area, not just striking. But I think the striking is probably it would probably be where their most narrow discrepancy is. That being said, Barriault has better striking numbers on volume, both offensively and defensively, than Curtis does, which I was really shocked to see. I wasn't as shocked with defensively because Curtis is known for, deliberately absorbing punches with shoulder rolls and stuff, so he doesn't really actually put himself in a position to get knocked out. But the cost of that is it still counts as punches landing, even if they're not really hurting as much. And you see it reflected in his stats where he actually absorbs more significant strikes than he lands by a margin of almost 1 because that's just what his defensive style is. Whereas Barriault is landing 0.7 more significant strikes for every one that he absorbs, or every 5 or for every roughly 6 significant strikes that Barriault throws, he's getting back a little over 5. So he's got a better trade-off in that respect than Curtis does. And then the other thing relative to just the crowd is that, as I've said, it's a big theme of the show, the fight going the distance experience. Curtis has Barriault more than doubled up. He's had 20 trips to decision, and while he's not been consistently successful, I would say, he at least has had a bit better showings in those regards than what we have seen from Barriault when he's had to go the distance. A big reflection of that is, Barriault's early UFC career, which may or may not have been, tainted by PEDs. He already did have one fight in his career overturned due to a no contest, but that was also the first 3 fights of his career, and then the last 2 decisions that he's had, he's won each of them against Dalcha Lungiambula and most recently Eric Anders, although that was at UFC 289 with the help of a Canadian crowd. And to that point, that fight should have been a 29-28, 1-1 going into the third, but one of the reasons that Barriault was able to get a 30-27 is because the crowd made enough of an impression on Barriault's action in the second round that the judges kind of totally discredited anything that Anders did. So it should have been 29-28 going into the third, but that's a really great example of how the crowd can heavily influence an outcome when the fight goes to decision. And I'm going to be worried about that here for Chris Curtis too, especially because Curtis is a guy that in his most recent appearances has religiously taken off the first round to kind of do the download the data thing. I know as the commentary team likes to say that Peter Yan does. Curtis is a guy, he'll come on strong in the third when he does do that. I thought that he outright won the final round against Gastelum with that strategy, but the problem is judges don't always agree. One judge did give Gastelum a 30-27 in spite of that, and so you're looking at a position where do you want to take a 2-1 favorite where the likelihood is it's going to come down to who wins the second round, and you're going to have Curtis in a position where he's trying to implement the feedback he's gotten from the first round that he may presumably lose, and will be needing to implement that in an emphatic, impression-making fashion up against whatever success Barriault has already had in addition to the crowd reaction. So I do have Curtis graded to win because I think that there's still a universe in which Curtis knocks out Barriault because we've seen, even though it's only been one knockout, the fact that Barriault got put away as fast as he did against Njokuani only 2 years ago speaks to the fact that the guy's chin can be had. We haven't necessarily seen that for Curtis. His only knockout loss of that 30-10 record that he has was in highly unorthodox circumstances in which he was taking his second MMA fight of the day for PFL after losing a unanimous decision earlier in the night. So, barring Chris Curtis taking a surprise filling in earlier in the card that evening, I think it's unrealistic to expect that he's going to get knocked out by one of Barriault's strikes. And neither of these guys are particularly active with their submissions. Barriault maybe a little bit more so, but Curtis has not attempted a submission in his UFC career yet, and Barriault has a submission win over Jordan Wright, I believe by mounted guillotine, but has otherwise not really shown a more advanced level UFC submission game, which would make you think that if he's able to somehow break Curtis's extremely solid takedown defense, that he's going to be able to implement a submission or get his hooks in to even find one. So I would say Curtis getting a finish is more likely than Curtis winning a decision. And I don't love the price on him, but in a card that has had so much like market movement, and with Curtis kind of staying in that 180, 190 price tag all week, I don't think I'm going to make him a leg. I might do a hedge thing, but I am going to be picking him to win. And I'll be rooting for him to win, but I won't be surprised at all if we see the normal rhythm from Curtis, which is that takes the first round off, and that ends up coming back to bite him because he's not able to turn it up fast enough by the end of the fight, particularly when he's fighting in an unfriendly environment where his opponent is going to be cheered on for anything he does, including merely breathing on his opponent. So give me Chris Curtis, but I wouldn't put the house on it. The next fight is Mike Malott and Neil Magny. All right, I'm not going to try to harp on this one for very long because I don't really want to pay it any more attention than I thought it was worth, but I will say this. I have Malott barely graded to win this, but my analysis has always been one that has loved Magny just because of how vastly experienced and long he is for the weight class. That's why last year I had Magny very heavily graded to beat Gilbert Burns in a fight that was lined almost identically to this one. And Yeah, I think I might have put out Magny as a speculative underdog just because it's like I hate what the line is on this, even though I don't. I might have put out the over, actually, because I had Magny. I think that's what I did. I put out the over because I expected Magny to make it more competitive than people were insisting it would be, and then Burns obviously comes out and submits him in the first round. I think you've got a similar bit of a setup situation here. Malott's obviously going to also have the Canadian crowd behind him as probably, arguably, he might be the biggest Canadian. You hesitate to even call him a star because the guy's only 10-1-1 and has, hardly fought anybody at the UFC level at this point. But the guy is probably the biggest Canadian star on this card, or at least the name that the locals are going to be most intrigued to that isn't tied to the main event. So I am impressed from what I've seen with Malott. I'm just not impressed at the fighters that he's done it against. Magny is going to very easily be the best fighter that he's had to face by a pretty wide margin. And when your level up in competition is a guy that has been traditionally known as a gatekeeper, that can spell problems. It didn't for someone like Ian Gary, but Ian Gary had also gotten to face the ghost of Daniel Rodriguez prior to getting that big fight against Magny that kind of boosted his profile a little bit, if somewhat poorly given the pamphlets his spouse has put out, before their relationship. But getting away from Gary, the thing that I didn't realize about Malott prior to putting out the stay away is that I had assumed that he was still at Team Alpha Male, which is how he had been able to retain a lot of his sharpness and kind of move up through weight classes effectively, because you got to remember, for a guy that hasn't had a lot of experience, this is a guy whose MMA career started at featherweight. Now he's fighting at welterweight. So he's added 25 pounds in the decade long that his career has lasted, and now he's coming into the highest level. And this is a former featherweight fighting Neil Magny. And not only that, it's a guy who left one of the best gyms in the world, Team Alpha Male, indisputable, to go to Niagara Top Team, which, I'm not going to rag on him too hard, but you're going to have a tough time convincing me that Niagara Top Team is giving you the same level of preparedness and sharpness that Team Alpha Male would. Now, Malott had made that switch prior to his fight with Adam Fugit, and he, was still very, very comfortably performing in that fight as a 2-1 favorite. But I just don't think that Malott has done enough here to justify the price tag against someone like Magny, who is, we know what his role is. His specific duty is to fraud check people like this. And I'm not saying that Malott is a fraud, but he is indisputably experiencing a level up in competition here. And you just wonder how he's going to respond to that, particularly as a fighter that does not have much experience going the distance, whereas Magny, that is his wheelhouse. Malott has one trip to a decision in his UFC career, or in his MMA career, and it was a draw. Magny's gone the distance 20 times. Even when he gets 30-24 against Ian Gary, he survives to the end. So if he's able to outlast the initial onslaught from Malott, as few have, but few have been leveled up to do so, presumably, what's going to happen in the second half of this fight? Especially if Malott isn't earning a compromising fight-ending position. Now, I still think Malott could knock him out early, so it probably goes further than him just trying to find a submission. But, again, there's enough variables here. Magny's going to have the height, 7-inch reach advantage. His takedown defense is pretty average, I think. I would think that Malott's probably able to put it down, or get the fight down there at some point. I think it's just a question of how quickly. Much more active submission game, too, than Magny, obviously. But Magny's got more UFC finishes, so it's not like he's just a decision machine. He is a guy that will, work for his own impressive results. But when the fight does go the distance, it's clearly proven to be where Magny's most comfortable. And there's a case to be made for him succeeding in the second half of this fight if Malott isn't able to put him away quickly. So I graded Malott to win. That was before I realized the camp switch. If I had been aware of that, I'm going to be honest, I would probably play Magny at plus 300. But I already put out the pick to stay away, and I've only got one other underdog on the card anyway. And in a card where I'm looking at maybe only 6 or 7 plays, probably 7 at this moment. I would rather just stay off the co-main, enjoy this one as a fan, and then see what happens in the main event. So I'll still say Malott wins, but I do not blame anybody for taking a shot on Magny. And for anybody that, is being criticized for making that bet, I mean, you're not going to hit a plus 300 underdog unless you actually have the balls to put it down on that money line. That's coming from a guy that bet Dricus Du Plessis at 300 last year to beat Robert Whittaker. That's coming from a guy that bet Serhiy to beat Lucas Alexander at plus 385 last year. And I'm not going to remind y'all of who was one of the only people to pick Elvis Brenner last year against Guram Kutateladze, but you understand the point that I'm making here. So scared money don't make none. Play Magny if you want to, but don't be surprised if Malott wins. And now we come to the main event, which is Sean Strickland and Dricus Du Plessis. I couldn't have dreamed of this title fight a year ago. I mean, you want to know how crazy MMA is? Just think about the year that Sean Strickland had last year. Sean Strickland lost the weirdest fight I've ever seen to Jared Cannonier. A fight that was scored 49-46 in 3 separate ways to a split decision by 3 different judges. Everybody who watched that fight has a different opinion about how it could have gone. I saw some people saying there was a case for Cannonier 50-45 as much as there was a case for Strickland 48-47. And I think that's a totally accurate read. So imagine you're Strickland. You just got knocked out by Pereira, and then you take this fight and you lose. And you're kind of, you've lost all this good momentum that you had from earlier in the year when you beat Hermanson, crushed him, and did the same to Uriah Hall by decision in the year prior. So Strickland had some decent momentum that totally went up in smoke, and then people are kind of wondering, where's, what's going to happen to this, brash guy that is, turning into kind of a decision machine and has really weird fundamentals. Well, Strickland, who, has, I mean, it's just so interesting to hear about what he's gone through relative to how many other victims of child abuse experienced learned helplessness. And I don't think learned helplessness is even in Strickland's vocabulary. How many other fighters would have taken an immediate main event after losing to Cannonier in the fashion that they did? Strickland became the first fighter in UFC history to headline back-to-back main events because he did that. Because he did the company a favor. And then he beat Nasruddin Imavov considerably on short notice in the first main event of last year. That made a big impression on the UFC. And it showed that he's willing to be a company guy, and he's been on the record saying he's cool with playing that role for them. But that was a big trust-building moment, I think. And he did them another favor then when nobody wanted to fight Abus Magomedov, and Strickland said, I'll take that easily too, because nobody else is wanting to take this, and you guys paid some good money to lure this guy over from PFL. And Strickland rope-a-dope the hell out of him on what was the final leg of the best night that I had last year. And then he gets rewarded by getting his title shot finally. And nobody expects him to win. And the thing that I remember the most about that fight is what's her name? The Octagon girl, Brittany Renner, I think. Oh God, Brittany. You all know who she is. She's about to retire. You got to watch the reverse angle replay of when Strickland drops Izzy, and just watch the pure shock on the faces of the ring girls. Brittany has no idea what she has just witnessed. Nobody, and these are women that are routinely bored sitting front row for these fights because they've seen it all. Nobody expected that. It was the most inexplicable domination in any title fight I think anybody's ever seen. And I think that it was so inexplicable that it's kind of gassed Strickland's own ability up a little bit heading into this fight. I mean, is it not interesting? It's narrowed down to sort of a pick'em range at this point. But is it not so interesting that Strickland was a plus 500 underdog to Izzy, and is now and was pretty considerably favored all week to win this fight? That doesn't happen very often, especially given, how out of left field it was, despite the fact that he earned it. It's still shocking to me to see where the market was initially thinking this fight was going to be. But the flip side of that is Du Plessis seems to finally be getting the credit that he deserves. And this is another fighter who I didn't have the boogeyman thing with Strickland where I bet him to beat Pereira and he didn't, and then I bet him to beat Cannonier and he didn't, and then I had to turn it around last year by going 3 for 3 on reads for his fights, including 2 fights in which I bet the over at plus odds, and those both hit, and then bet him as a favorite over Magomedov. But my point is, I've been on the Du Plessis train since International Fight Week 2 years ago. And in fact, even before that, I remember trying to get ahead of my the events when I was, initially building the database of fighters. And back then, Dricus was an underdog in a booking with Kevin Gastelum. And I was so ready for the fade on Gastelum for Du Plessis, and I thought that he was being discredited. I think Du Plessis was a plus 140 favorite around that time. Fight got canceled. We didn't get up to see him, but Du Plessis gets rebooked to fight Brad Taveras at UFC. I believe it was 276. And, that might have been his least encouraging performance of the most recent 4 that he has had, which is kind of bewildering to think about, that a guy like Taveras was able to push him as much as he did. But it didn't look good for him early, and then you just saw how that kind of weird, awkward effectiveness that I talked about in Du Plessis' fight with Whitaker, just ends up kind of weirding out opponents, and they're just not comfortable. And it's, if you remember my breakdown that I gave for when he fought Whitaker, I described Du Plessis' style as the muddy waters. And I will be curious to see how Strickland kind of reacts to being thrown into that, because we haven't really seen a lot of people take the initiative with Strickland to go to the ground of late. He is just very good at lulling all of his opponents into these pseudo sparring matches where he ends up getting the better of them just because of the awkward fundamentals. This is such an interesting fight because of the 2 different brands of awkward that each of these fighters brings to the table. And I think that there's a case for both of them winning. But the problem is, the main case that I've heard with Strickland is that, what's going to happen with Du Plessis with 5 rounds of cardio if it gets to that point? But, I mean, the big headline with Du Plessis, obviously, is since getting that nasal passage surgery, I mean, the cardiovascular is probably not the right word, even though we're talking about cardio, but the breathing, the lung system, just his ability to, channel oxygen in and out of him, that's a really key part of cardio too. And the fact that he's presumably had his nasal passage fixed now, where he's able to look better, I think, or presumably look better later into fights. I think that there's, upside might be the wrong word, but I think that Du Plessis' ability to fight the distance is being a little bit discredited, even though we've hardly had to see him prove it as much in his UFC career or even his MMA career. And I know I just got done making a case for a bunch of other fighters why I think that's a concern, especially in the face of an opponent like Strickland, who's been to 17 decisions compared to Du Plessis' only one. But the one decision we saw Du Plessis go to against Taveras, I mean, he didn't look good early, and he was able to hurt Taveras as the fight went on, despite looking gassed or out of it in his own right. And he made enough of an impression in the final 10 minutes that he was able to win a unanimous decision and won the third round outright. So in the one time that we did see Du Plessis go to a decision at the UFC level prior to getting his nasal surgery, he was still able to win. Obviously, it's an insignificant sample size. It's just one fight with one fighter. But I think that he did enough there relative to the other context we have about him that people just blindly saying Strickland by decision because Du Plessis has no cardio, I just don't think that has a lot of merit. Whereas I look at what Du Plessis has for Strickland, and I think if this proves to be too awkward for him on the feet, and Strickland is just, he's succeeded in making it a weird sparring match, and Du Plessis is just struggling to break the defense. I mean, Du Plessis has his own brand of awkward for responding to that, and we just haven't seen Strickland really have to deal with the threat of takedowns in a lot of his recent fights. Certainly not against Izzy. Certainly not against Abus Magomedov. Nasruddin Imavov, I don't think really had any success with it. Not against Jared Cannonier. Obviously not against Pereira. And the Hermansson fight was almost exclusively standing, even though it went to a split decision that was pretty egregiously incorrect. Hermansson had no case for winning that fight. But my point is, I wonder if maybe, I see he fought Yatko. I would imagine that Yatko probably tried to get some takedowns on him, and he did shoot one. He shot one takedown on him. That was back in 2021. That was the fight right before he knocked out Brendan Allen. So I look at this for Strickland, and I see why people are favored him to win this initially, but it's closed much more to a pick'em now at this point, which is unfortunate for me because Du Plessis started the week as my only underdog, but it's going to be hard for me to ignore Du Plessis at that value in terms of making him a leg now if he's a favorite, especially if I'm going all juice on this card at this point. It's going to be hard for me to leave that guy out of the main event. He's one of my strongest grades this week. I've been so far on board with him since prior to the Taveras fight. Made very, very easier work of Darren Till than I think a lot of people were expecting. The Brunson fight started a little concerning, but I was very confident that Brunson was going to fade much faster if he couldn't put Du Plessis away than the other way around, and that was proven correct. And then Du Plessis had no respect going into the Whitaker fight, and now you just see how one fight has totally flipped the narrative for not just Du Plessis, but also for Strickland relative to his fight with Adesanya. So it's just interesting to see relative to what the market had to say about these guys in their last fights, where it is now that they're getting paired up together to fight for the middleweight title. The last thing that I'll say is that I have a extremely large amount of sympathy for what Strickland has been through. And I haven't listened to the Theo Von podcast appearance yet, and I might listen to it tomorrow. But The bigger thing that stood out to me was before Strickland went outwardly public on the Theo Von podcast with all of that information, there was a much more revealing moment to me in his post-fight presser at UFC 293. And you have to consider that he was in the immediate aftermath of what on paper had to be the happiest moment of his life relative to everything else that he had been through and what he had worked for, and the fact that he was just on the winning end of one of the biggest upsets in MMA championship history, arguably the biggest. And in that moment, he is just asked to kind of summarize what he's thinking about by the press, and he immediately jumps into making a joke about how, his father abused him, and he's thinking about how that kind of powered him into the man that he needed to be to go do this, and sarcastically thanking his father and kind of laughing through the pain. But the pain was unmistakable, man. It was one of the most surreal moments I've ever seen in an athlete's press conference. And it speaks to how tortured of a man that guy Sean Strickland is. So while I don't condone much of the behavior or things that he's said this week, I think going out of your way to criticize him without understanding what the guy has been through is inappropriate, in the same way that you would probably feel a lot of what he has said and done is inappropriate. And I would hope that we can be more sympathetic to victims of abuse, particularly child abuse, because I feel like Strickland's story is not being told in the way that would be most helpful for not only him, but also his fans that maybe have experienced similar transgressions against themselves in the past and need a symbol like Strickland, if not to feel better about themselves, then to just at least show them that there is a way out towards better things that isn't what Strickland has described he would be doing if he didn't have mixed martial arts to fall back on. Now, all that being said, I frame it around that to point out that I think that it's going to be impossible for him to avoid fighting emotionally. And I think Du Plessis knows that, and Du Plessis is going to be able to take advantage of that. It wouldn't shock me at all if Du Plessis did something like yell out, "Who's your daddy?" from across the cage before the fight starts. And I think that in one of those, and we've seen Strickland fight emotional, although he was better about it, not really showing it until the end of the fight with Adesanya. We've still seen him, talk with his opponents and get brash and whatever, but we've also seen him kind of recede and get scared when he's been touched and knows things aren't going well, which is kind of what happened in the final round of his fight with Cannonier after he got his nose bloodied up. I think if he gets hurt by Du Plessis in one of the first two rounds, that you're going to kind of see a similar effect with what happened in the Cannonier fight, where he's a little bit more tentative and gun shy and not necessarily as sharp defensively for setting up his offense as he was against Adesanya and in a lot of his other fights. I'm going to say Du Plessis gets the finish. I don't know what round it happens. I'd be stunned if it was a first round finish. I would think, second or third round is probably more of what I would be expecting, despite Strickland's ability to go the distance. I wouldn't be surprised if Du Plessis gets a decision either, but I just don't see a spot in which Strickland wins this fight by any way other than decision, and I don't think that it's responsible to bet him as the favorite for that reason. So I've got Du Plessis very strongly graded to win. This would be my fifth pick on Du Plessis in a row to hit, and I am optimistic that he will be wearing the gold around his waist at the end of the night, and the UFC's dream of Du Plessis versus Izzy at UFC Africa will be on once again. All right, so that's going to do it for the RAXPOD for UFC 297. Thank you very much for tuning in. I will be back for UFC 298. As I said, I'm going to be only doing these for the pay-per-views going forward, or at least for the time being. It's just less stress on me that way for, the position that I'm in right now, IRL. But I'm very grateful to you all for tuning in, as I, kind of alluded to before breaking down which fight was it earlier that I said the thank you on? I believe it was Charles Jourdain, Sean Woodson right before that. So if you are one of these fans that listens to the whole thing and shows love on Twitter or elsewhere, I really am grateful for that, and it provides a nice spark and a bit of extra fuel and incentive for getting this done when that people are enjoying it and responding positively to it. So thank you very much, everyone. I will see you once again for UFC 298, but I'll have picks out for the other fight nights prior to that, and we'll see how things go. But until then, thank you, take care, and have a nice weekend.